Good evening, everybody. Lovely to be with you again. It's a very exciting occasion, actually, I think, because we're going to talk about a book, the very first copies of which have just arrived here in Jaipur. It's not available anywhere else in the world yet. And having had the privilege of reading it, it's a book that's going to be talked about a great deal in the coming years, I think, around the world. So it's a particular excitement, I think, to be in at the birth of a conversation, which I think Rana is going to begin, not just for us, but for the world. He's raising some really very fundamental questions about the way in which we organize our politics, our societies, our international relations. It's an extraordinary book. I can't think of anyone else in the world who could have written it. So I'm going to begin just by asking Rana to give us an introduction to the ideas in the book. So he's just going to give us 10 or 15 minutes of an outline. It's a long, brilliant, detailed, extraordinarily erudite book, but he's going to attempt to give us a sense of it in about 10 or 15 minutes, so please do.
Thank you, Fintan, and thank you, everybody. As he says, I just saw this for the first time about 10 minutes ago, and it's very much the first of these sessions I've ever done. It's a 500-page book, and thank you. I don't know how to talk about it yet, so this is my first attempt, so forgive me if I'm probably long-winded. First thing I wanted to say is that it is a very nice coincidence that we're in the Fondation Jean Michalski Durbar Hall, because the first words of this book were written at the Jean Michalski Foundation in Switzerland, which was the most amazing and inspiring retreat. Vera Michalski is here in the first row, and it's just a very nice thing to be able to give this back to her in some way. So, as Fintan says, I want to try and distill into 10 or 15 minutes some of the perspective that this book offers. It is a book that took a long time, and I started working on it back in 2018. This was a time when Trump was in his first presidency, Brexit was fresh, Modi, of course, was already prime minister here, Le Pen was transforming politics in France, and those were the four countries that I was moving between a lot of that time. But of course, Russia had also invaded Ukraine for the first time. Viktor Orban was becoming a very eloquent, anti-liberal proponent in Hungary. And all over the world, we started to see liberalism being dismantled in some way or another. And clearly, given the fact that the nation state is twinned with this ideology of liberalism, the two were born in the same circumstances, there was something about this attack on liberalism that seemed to have wider political implications. Now, individual countries each treated this as their own individual or national problem. Britain was in a kind of introspective crisis over Brexit. France was panicking over how to deal with the rise of the far right. And each of them thought this was their own separate problem. And my book began with a question: might this actually be something systemic? Not a French problem or an American problem or an Indian problem, but rather a problem of the nation-state system itself. And the nation-state system is not an object that we talk about very much. We don't have much of a language for this system as a system. But I felt that we were looking, that this system was a single object, and I wanted to tell the story of that system. And in the process to try and identify what its purpose was. Not what should nation states be or what should the nation state system be, but what is it? How does it characteristically behave, and what are its purposes, in order to try and understand where all these things that were unfolding were going to go. So I guess the headline of the book is that we are all in the midst of a great historical transition. It is a transition as momentous, let's say, as the end of feudalism, as the shift in the 18th century of the economic center of the world from Asia to Europe. It is a major transition. And like those other transitions, it is not, therefore, simply the story of a few individuals. There are individuals who dominate our press. We're obsessed with them. We're obsessed with their psyches. What are they going to do next and all that sort of thing. But my book offers the perspective that, in fact, these individuals are aligning themselves with grand forces that would be operating even in their absence. The symptoms of that transition are instability in the cellular system of nation states, nationalism, imperialism, war, etc. And of course, there are many, many causes, and my book tells 4 big stories. Those stories are called God, money, law, and nature. But here I'm just going to give, for 5 minutes, I think what is the most obvious cause of this transition, or origin of this transition, and that is the unwinding of the American empire. It might seem paradoxical that the United States is resorting to imperialism because it is no longer the imperial power. The whole point of the American empire was that the United States did not go and occupy the world. That was what Britain did. That's what France had done. The American empire was an empire of non-occupation. It was a virtual empire that was based on systems of law and finance. So how did this empire work? The American empire was projected through the system of independent nation states. The sovereign nation state was to the American empire what the province was to the Roman Empire. And what happened from the 1940s and 50s onwards was that America designed a system of control of the internal DNA of nation-state systems, using Wall Street, using arm's length authority. I'm getting this echo. Is this disturbing anyone else? Using arm's length authorities like the World Bank or the IMF, essentially to control the world's nation states and to prop up the capitalist system and, of course, American supremacy. Now, the American empire was, for much of the world, disastrous. Here we're talking about the period from about 1945 to, let's say, 1990. 20 million people died in the third world chaos that was produced during that time. Both the US and the Soviet Union propped up brutal strongmen who arrested political development in their countries, killed many of their citizens, et cetera, et cetera. And inequality between countries reached its maximum point in 1974. That is to say that long after the European empires had ceased to exist, inequality between different regions of the world continued to grow, and many countries became poorer in the 1970s and 80s than they had been under European empire. However, the corollary was that there were spectacular achievements in the West and in certain parts of Asia, Latin America, etc. Spectacular achievements due to the accumulation and concentration of wealth and the ability to dispense that wealth in terms of political rights, etc. The high industrial period of the West demanded democracy, it demanded welfare because it rested on an enormous industrial workforce. And so it seemed in that period in the West as if the nation state, which we define as the monopoly on violence, had been tamed. It looked as if the interests of the state were identical with the interests of the people in that state, and that the nation state represented a kind of end of history, a solution to all human problems. what we are all aware of now is that that period was totally exceptional in human history. Never before or since had state interests coincided with those of their citizens so much. Never again would states be able to afford the benefits that they had afforded during that period. And as that period started to unwind, state interests would start to diverge from those of their people. So today we live in a world that's completely different from the world of the decades following World War II. The US is massively indebted. The US, which had 50% of industrial capacity in the 1950s, now has about 15, much, much less than China. About half of American labor is non-strategic labor. So increasingly, America doesn't really need its own population in the way that it used to. The dollar is volatile. America's hold over the capitalist system is diluted. And American military power and even its intellectual grasp of what is going on in the world is hugely diminished. And we now have rival managers of the capitalist system, including not only China, but also crucial powers like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. All this takes us into a very, very different kind of political territory from what nearly every living person has always experienced. But the important thing to understand is that that territory is the historical norm, and this is why I found it in my book so important to talk about the nation-state over long historical timeframes. The multipolar reality we are entering into is the normal condition of human beings. It is rare. The last two capitalist superpowers, Britain and the United States, have dominated the capitalist system to an absolutely overwhelming extent. They have provided the currency, they have set the terms of transactions, and they have had huge military power to back up other things. And during the high points of British and American power, though those two powers were themselves extremely violent, they interfered in other countries' affairs and all that sort of thing, there was overwhelmingly less violence than, let's say, in the 30 Years' War from 1914 to 1945, when the question of who would succeed Britain as the superpower was undecided. So between the high point of British power and the high point of American power was a period of enormous destructiveness. We are now entering into another period where there is no single power determining the fate of the world. In this upcoming period, I think it's likely that some states will effectively disappear. There are already several states like Somalia or Libya or Yemen or Sudan that are failing many of the kind of basic definitions of statehood. But to finish this sort of little introductory summary, I want to make a few other observations about what this period that we're entering into is going to look like. The first is that the US internally is unwinding to a condition that we can understand best by looking at Britain in the 19th or 18th centuries. In 2020, I wrote a piece for Harper's in which I said that the US could no longer afford direct democracy, and that Britain in the 18th century was the model that it was starting to unwind to, and that oligarchs and political managers were going to sabotage a lot of the rights and freedoms that Americans had. I never believed at that time that things would happen as quickly as they have since. But it's quite fascinating to see such terrifying events as the recent killing of Renee Good in Minnesota, because you realize that the event itself is less significant than the education in cruelty that's happened since, where clearly the US administration is attempting to reset Americans' understanding of what their own significance is as citizens of that country, and to hugely diminish their political claims. It's interesting that rape, and I'm thinking here, of course, of the Jeffrey Epstein ongoing saga, is becoming an image of contemporary states. rape was as an image of feudal societies. Rape is a myth of societies that are terrified of the extractions that a kind of overweening elite are able to commit. And rape is again becoming the image of the American state. Another observation is that 18th century Britain was depended for its dynamism and its global reach on world-changing corporations, which were traded amongst and profited essentially British elites. During the the global war with France, Britain depended enormously on the East India Company. Now America depends on Silicon Valley in much the same way. America's attempt to remain ahead of China is subcontracted in important ways to Silicon Valley, which gives Silicon Valley all kinds of leverage over Washington and over state policy. So Musk wishes to break up the EU because the EU stands up against Silicon Valley and seeks to regulate it. And these kinds of policies can be internalized by Washington because Silicon Valley is calling many of the shots. Thirdly, I think as we reach this kind of situation, we start to realize the nation-state system is not a moral system. It is an economic system whose purpose is to concentrate profit. It's a class system. It concentrates wealth and order in some places, and it exports poverty, war, ecological breakdown to others. And it immobilizes a large amount of the global population so they may not flee that condition. And that, in that respect, the nation-state system is totally intact. It's doing exactly what it should. And the last point I want to make is that the nation-state is the most efficient kind of violence that has ever been invented. It is defined as a monopoly on violence, and it comes into being by suppressing all rival forms. And the only thing that has prevented it from enormous destruction of its own citizenry and of the citizenry of other countries is various forms of liberalism and all the institutional things that go with liberalism. As we see liberalism being dismantled, we are in danger of reverting to forms of intra and interstate violence that unfortunately are leaping again out of the pages of history books. And I'll stop my little summary there and we can chat.
Well done. Thank you. One of the things that struck me reading the book, that came into my mind, is perhaps the greatest compliment ever paid to the state. The progressives on the left tend to be critics of the state, naturally. But Hannah Arendt's statement that the worst thing you can possibly be is stateless was, in a way, shone a light on the golden age of the nation state in a strange way, of course, in a time of terror. But, you know, that the state provided the idea of citizenship, which in turn at least gave those who were citizens access to protections and rights. So how did that idea of citizenship develop, and why is it now under so much stress?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting that the people who don't have states today are at the very center of our global story. I'm thinking, of course, of Palestine, but also of Greenland, which is a dependency of Denmark. So all these, there are, by my calculations, about 0.25% of human beings are stateless in some way or another. It's interesting that they are in the news every day because these are remaining possibilities of predatory behavior by states. In a world of nation states, being stateless is the worst kind of condition. So I think the story or asking about here is in some ways the most familiar story of our shared culture of states, which is to say that the disaster of 1945, or the disaster that led up to 1945, was indeed, seemed to require some kind of moral response. If we are generous to the people who were redesigning the world at that time, and never has there been a time in history when the world was A, more destroyed, or when a small number of people had such power to redesign it. So people could literally get together in a room and draw up a diagram of what the world was going to be like. And they imagined a system of sovereign states, and those sovereign states would be the highest authorities in the global system, and each of those states would guarantee to their citizens a set of rights that was recorded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And of course, this was a moment of absolute euphoria in much of the world, because empire, the European empire, was written out of this story. It was part of history. India, of course, is one of the primary kind of instigators of the new world of nation states and the new world of citizenship. Eleanor Roosevelt, who had a lot to do with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, had a very high-flown language of what that world was going to be like. Now, already there are compromises, because everybody knew, we had just seen what had happened in Nazi Germany, that in some ways a national government was the last agency that could be entrusted with guaranteeing the rights of its own citizens. No agency on earth had more interest in infringing those rights than their own government. So you were basically setting yourself up for failure by asking, at that point, about 100 and now about 193 national governments to be their own policemen, as it were. Today, in 2026, we don't trust even the architects of that system to stand up and defend their citizens' rights according to those terms. We see the US government becoming one of the principal threats to its own citizens. But on the basis of the last 80 years, it's very, very difficult for anyone to believe that national governments in general can be the best defenders of their citizens' rights. And I would just mention two countries that I've had some dealings with recently as an illustration. One is Ghana, where I just returned to. I was accompanying my wife, who's researching her own book, Peasants, which is going to be a big book out later this year, looking at the farmers of the world. Ghana is a country that is extracting, using state institutions essentially to extract from farmers and fuel a system of corruption and debt, state debt. The state has been hijacked, you could say, as a system, essentially, of privatization of social wealth. That is the same story as in many, many countries today. So the idea that states will exist for the affluence of their citizens, there's no reason for them to do so. The other country, of course, is Iran, whose badge I'm wearing here because my wife and her family are, my wife's from Iran and her family are missing right now because we have no communication of where they are in the midst of these protests. Iran is not a failed state. Iran is not a non-state. Iran meets all the criteria of statehood. It is a monopoly on violence, etc., etc. But it has used the attributes of statehood essentially to conduct a 45-year war on its own citizens. And this is totally within the possibilities of what states can be. So I think at this point, it's very difficult for us to believe that the entire architecture that was put into place in 1945, the United Nations, Universal Declarations, etc., are a sufficient guarantee for the people of the world against the most violent engines of the world.
Yes. You mentioned Trump and your own depressingly prescient notions about what would happen in America, and it dramatizes your argument to an extraordinary degree, doesn't it? I mean, where the United States, with profound hypocrisy and double dealing, nonetheless branded itself as the great protector. And going back to Wilson, you know, I mean, it really goes back to the end of the First World War. You know, the idea of the nation state as the norm, you know, is very much put forward by the United States, and it's developed by the United States after the Second World War. And it's linked to democracy, you know, that democracy and nation state go together. And it's now dramatically abandoning that idea of itself, both internally as a democracy and externally. It's been very striking in Venezuela, you know, the classic regime change. They're not even doing that, you know, they're not even saying, well, this woman probably won the election, she should be the new leader of the country with American support. So the lack of pretense suggests a certain kind of, you know, there might be an extraordinary stupidity around Trump, but there's a certain kind of intelligence as well, isn't there, which is saying that we're not playing, that's not the game we're playing anymore. And that seems to, sadly, validate the more pessimistic parts of your argument.
Exactly. I mean, I think that as I said at the very beginning, it is because the US has lost, I mean, it never obeyed those rules anyway. Yeah. But it did think in 2003 that it had to go through the motions in order to, the UN has always been something of a puppet organization, but you keep the illusion of the puppet show alive by visiting it and all this. Now that's no longer necessary, and I think, as I say, that this marks a significant transition. The fact that you no longer pay lip service to those institutions is because the entire fabric of the old imperial system is falling apart, and now we are simply in a contest of great powers. And even the pretense of a legal system is gone. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. I mean, in this century, nearly every major action by a major power has been declared illegal by international law. And if everything is illegal, then clearly international law does not play any role in the actual decision-making of states. But I think, you know, the United States has been responsible for an astonishing level of destruction and death since 1945. But to reiterate, it was always sold to the American people as something that was necessary in their defense and for their well-being and affluence. And so Americans actually had an extraordinarily robust view of their own citizenship. They felt that it was a citizenship guaranteed by the dollar, guaranteed by the US military, and that somehow violence in Vietnam and everything was reinforcing it. What we did not expect is that the US would pull the rug out from under its own citizenship, its own citizens, and declare them too to be part of the enemy forces. Now American citizens are terrorists. Now American citizens are the enemy. And we see a state that is abandoning the discourse of our citizens being sacred, and that any kind of violence is justifiable in their defense. Now we have a state fighting its battles against its own citizenships and against the rest of the world, and that's quite novel.
Yes. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to go into the wonderful historical detail that's in the book, and I don't want to give a false impression of the book in a way that it's only about now. I mean, as you say, it's a work of long history, looking through Britain France, America, and China as particular lenses for the way in which states developed. But we probably have to just leap forward. One of the things I was afraid of when I saw the title of the book is that, oh, it's another book about how we need world government, or the nation state's going to just fade away. And the title, it's a very catchy title, and it gets at the point, but it's slightly misleading in the sense that that's not at all what the book is talking about. And I wonder, would you just give us a sense of where you're getting to towards the end of the book? Because you're not giving us prescriptions for the future, but you are challenging us to think about alternative ways in which the rights that we enjoy as citizens, we might continue to enjoy or reinvent in a context where our nation states are not capable of sustaining those rights first.
Yeah, it's very difficult to end a book like this because clearly one needs some answers. I'd say just two things on this subject. One is nation states are not going away. They are the other face of the capitalist system. And just as capitalism is not going away, nation states are not going away. And just as capitalism goes through many changes and crises, so do nation states. So a nation state in 2050 might be a totally different object from a nation state in 1950. And so what constitutes politics and what strategies people and communities and citizens need to adopt also changes correspondingly. So as I end the book with an extremely gloomy sense of what nation states are going to continue doing for their citizens in the near future, whether they're in the West or anywhere else, I suggest that a very obvious thing that we as human beings can do to sort of start to build alternative systems, alternative platforms for community and political organization is to have a universal digital citizenship. To start to wean ourselves off the state. We've basically given everything to the state. The state has a complete political monopoly, and we don't have anything outside of state auspices. So simply to begin to create the conditions of possibility for a politics, a political community that is not given to us by the state, that would be an obvious first action. And we've seen in our own lifetime with big data companies, with cryptocurrency, with all kinds of digital systems, that those systems can acquire immense scale very fast in ways that we never predicted. Facebook acquired, 3 billion users without any armies. It didn't invade any countries to take their citizens. It created alternative forms of community, of conversation, of information sharing, propaganda, doing lots of the things that nation states themselves do without declaring war on any nation state. So there are precedents for things acquiring enormous scale and changing all kinds of practices. Facebook supplied social possibilities that we didn't have before, and 3 billion people wanted them. Think if we could supply legal and political needs that people have, how many people might need them. Now, the other comment I want to make on this front is that we have become a little obsessed in India, in the United States, in lots of the world, with the idea that democracy means the ability to vote in or out a government. Now, to the people who did not have democracy, let's say in 18th century Britain, that was only one of the things they wanted. They wanted, yes, the ability to vote on who governed the country, but they also wanted the ability to control their economic life in a much more direct way. That was to say, they wanted rights over currencies, they wanted rights over labor organization, they wanted to be the managers of their own economies. Now that aspect of things has somewhat disappeared, And even in advanced and substantial democracies, where people can vote out their governments easily, they cannot reject the national currency. They cannot do they cannot intervene in the economy in very substantial ways. Now, I think that again, our digital life, the lessons of cryptocurrency and things like this show us that a lot of the people who are poor in the world today, who are poor insofar as they are unable to lay their hands on the national currency, which is convertible to the dollar, and therefore they are deemed poor and they can't transact. It's possible to imagine currency systems that would allow them to transact with their neighbors in lots of ways without any of them possessing, Kenyan shillings or whatever currency it might be. We can put some of the political questions which obsess us on one side and look at the sheer economic scandal that is the nation-state system, which is a system which is built essentially to continue a continuous transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich of the world. We can intervene on that, in that front, in ways that do not require states to fall and all that sort of thing, by just creating new forms of economic transaction, new kinds of economy that I think will do a lot of our work for us.
Right. We have a few minutes for a few questions. What I'm going to do is maybe just take 3, and then I'll put them back to Rana. There's a woman, the first hand I saw is right back there. So if you wouldn't mind just waiting for the microphone, thank you.
Thank you very much. An amazing book. I have a weird question for you. Do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic put any pressure on nation states? Because in some ways, nation states went head to head for availability of vaccines, ability for economic support, and it shone a light on where we stood in terms of the efficiency and care of our various nation states at the time.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just there's a gentleman right at the front here, and then there's a gentleman about 4 rows back. So thank you. So first here and then back. Thank you.
Thank you for that, sir. When politics has become a business and business has become managing politics, do you think nation states will become like corporations, which they are in somewhat, so there'll be cross-fertilization between the two, which is already happening?
Thank you very much. And just a gentleman there. Yes, thank you. I'll come back. Hopefully we'll get a second round of questions, but thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. My question was, how realistic do you think it is to expect alternative trading blocs like BRICS to have a counter to American hegemony and power? And I'm also curious, did something similar happen before the unwinding of the British Empire in terms of alternative trading blocs? Thanks.
Great questions. Thank you very much. So there's the question about the pandemic, about whether states are becoming like corporations, and the question about BRICS and similarities to the unwinding of the British Empire.
These are all fascinating subjects. COVID is a very, very amazing intervention, unplanned intervention in all these processes. I think, and I agree with lots of what you say. I would just add to that in COVID massively accelerated the digitization of life, the ability of a few data companies essentially to control all social, professional processes, and probably accelerated by several years their ability to wield the power that they have today. So I think that nation states have found themselves, to some extent, the data companies. Silicon Valley is the first major geopolitical threat to nation states since they began. There has not been a newcomer to the geopolitical stage since the foundation of the nation state to rival that of Silicon Valley. So states have been thrown into confusion by this threat, and they've all had to adapt to it in various ways. And I think that when you look at what Microsoft and Google and all those kind of companies were doing in early 2020, they saw this opportunity very clearly for managing cities, managing logistics, and all that. And I think I would add to that COVID has, in that sense, also made states much more susceptible to various kinds of cyber war. So I think another part of this conversation is also about the changing nature of warfare. So historically, a war began and it ended, and then everybody went back to peace. Today, states are at war every day. There's not really a beginning or an end to it. And so, and those wars are waged not only by other states, but by companies, by private individuals, by terror groups. And so the sense that the state exists separately from the companies that run the logistics and separate from the military, all these things are now very confused. And I think that the state, therefore, has also lost its definition in the process. States as business, I mean, it always has been to some extent. As I say, the state is the other face of the capitalist system. But if you look again at the United States, the state was based on some kind of ability to control the relative power of private wealth. Antitrust, for instance, was used against, let's say, Rockefeller to ensure that his private wealth did not, climb to the levels that of sort of 2% of GDP or something like that, what he had in sort of 1912. The present day, the top 7 companies in the United States have a percentage of GDP in terms of their market cap, which is absolutely unprecedented. And so we are clearly getting to a stage where the state is no longer in a different kind of order of magnitude than private organizations. And therefore, inevitably, we will see a kind of blurring of the power between them. BRICS, I don't know if I'm the person to answer that question. I mean, yes, I do think that the US power relative to the rest of the world is going to decline. China is doing many, many experiments to de-dollarize, to digitalize its own currency. And China, there's a whole part of this argument in the book, which I can't get into right now, but China has leapfrogged the US in all kinds of ways, especially in Africa. So the United States felt that basically a market system would be adequate for extracting the resources and entering them into the capitalist system. China has said, no, we can do much better than that. We can deal with all kinds of crazy players, which could be states, which could be militant groups, warlords, etc. And we can do barters, we can do all kinds of very, very innovative contracts and transact in places that the US simply can't enter. And that has hugely increased the efficiency of goods entering the capitalist system, whether it's rare earth minerals, whether it's gold, whatever it is. So the US is outclassed in some respects by this. The UAE and Russia are doing similar things in Africa. And I think that's one of the reasons why the US itself is talking about Greenland in the way it is. It's trying to catch up. It's not ahead. It's trying to catch up with some of these. So I think given the levels of US debt, given the fragility of many of US systems, I think various forms of major collapse are very feasible. Wall Street, the dollar, etc., in ways that China is well placed to take up the slack, I think. But I think some of this is difficult to predict, and China is just patiently building lots of the systems that are going to be there if those kinds of collapse happen.
I promised to come back for one last question, and it was the gentleman at the front here I had pointed to, so I'll stick with that. I'm sorry for everybody else, but we're going to run out of time.
Thank you. So the current idea of a nation state is definitely diminishing, and which is led by a diminishing US hegemony. So, yeah, so apart from the diminishing US hegemony, what do you think is the second accelerator to it? Is it a financial system or a system led by China, or, you know, some dictatorships, you know, which are actually working, like, you know, we see Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso?
Yeah, things like what's happened in Burkina Faso, I don't think these are of major geopolitical. As I say, I've just been in Ghana. The turbulence in Burkina Faso is a major kind of regional story. But I think the second thing is obviously the rise of China. It clearly is the most significant event of the last 20 years, and it's a corollary to the dismantling of unwinding of US power. It's important to note that Western liberalism worked while the West was much richer than the rest of the world. And that was a very short period of time, and it coincided, the destruction of China and India was the precondition for Western liberalism. So when the Opium Wars happened, only at that point, when Britain was released from its sort of silver debts to China, did Britain start to invest money in its own population, extend the vote, liberalize trade laws, and all that sort of thing. And it's no coincidence that the rise of China has seen the return to authoritarian principles, the return of tariffs, the return of all kinds of 19th century practices in the West. So I think that, you know, the Chinese think about their rise to dominance as the restoration of Chinese power. And I think we should see it in the same terms, that there is an interregnum when China is essentially completely irrelevant to the global trading system. It's impossible to imagine a country that's so large and yet so isolated as China between the 1950s and the 1970s. As soon as China starts to enter the system again, the entire system then becomes centered on China once again. And everything that's happened in the West, especially in the bottom 50% of Western populations who find themselves suddenly competing for their jobs with Asia, all of that is related to the rise of China and has changed the West irreversibly. So I think, and that story has much longer further to play out.
I'm terribly sorry, we're going to have to wind up there. We could talk all night. The only consolation is we will be talking about this book for a very long time. I think it is a seminal work. It's also not a depressing book. It's a bracing book, it's a challenging book. But there is something actually fundamentally optimistic about the clarity of intellect that allows us to define and understand what's going on around us. And the last part of the book does really open up for us the possibilities of thinking about new ways of reinventing citizenship, of taking back power, and of saving the planet as well, which is something that we didn't really have a real chance to talk about. It really is a privilege for all of us that we've been here for the very beginning of the journey of this book. It will be available, and you will be able to get your hands on the very first copies, and you can have them signed by Rana. Rana, what an absolute pleasure, and congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much.